which is jointly hosted, in fact, this afternoon by UCL Health Mining Society and UCL Anthropocene, which are SHS strategic initiatives. So we're really delighted to welcome you to today's event focused on planetary health. It's a concept which has seen increased use across broad fields of academic and public discussion, focused on the growing effects and concerns with climate change, biodiversity loss, environmental degradation. As a concept, it's a relatively recent concept with planetary health, but it does orientate us to an approach which encompasses broader ecological and environmental concerns that are more than human, including multi-species well-being and survival across diverse temporal and spatial scales. Yet there may be also potential concerns and dangers, limitations to a generalising concept, a universalising framing of the current moment of environmental crisis through the lens of planetary health. So that's what we're going to discuss here today, these questions and more. We have 5 fantastic contributors from across diverse disciplinary fields, including those working in areas of health policy and also community health practice, to talk about us individually and collectively discuss how they engage with and critically reflect on the concept of planetary health. So we're really looking forward to their presentations, but we also want to open up the discussion today to those in the room to reflect in a more discursive way on this concept of planetary health. So the format for today will be short presentations of 5 to 7 minutes from each of the participants, and then we'll open up for wider discussion and raise your own questions and concerns. So we'll get going because we are delayed. So our first speaker I'm delighted to welcome today is Andrew Seaton, who is the Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in the History Department. He works on modern British medicine and environment and is based in Britain. Welcome, Andrew, and thank you.
Should I go there?
Yeah, wherever you'd like to be.
Hey. Okay, hello, hi. Thanks so much. I was just telling Sarah I'm going to talk on Monday at a college in Exeter where, because of the whole global internet outage, they couldn't log into the computer to put my slides up. And then I kind of ended up sort of describing photographs and graphs to a sort of hall of quite bored 18-year-olds, so I'm glad to do little things similar today. But really glad to be here to talk about planetary health. As Sarah intimated, a concept that, of course, has already had a lot of influence in how we think about health in the climate crisis. And as Sarah said, I'm a historian, and sort of broadly I write about politics, medicine, and the environment. And what I want to do, just in my 7 minutes today, is really to historicise the idea of planetary health. I suppose this is one of the health risks of being a historian, is that often you get put first on these kinds of panels because you work forward from the past. But to historicise the idea of planetary health. So on one hand, its history is very recent. The next slide. Yeah. So I put up here a Google Ngram, not the most scientific way of doing things, but it gives you a bit of a sense of really the upshot of use of the term planetary health. You can see it sort of first emerging in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and then a massive uptick in the the mid-2010s, which of course times with the publishing of the report of the Commission on Planetary Health in 2015, which I'm sure we can hear more about. But on the other hand, although that's a very recent history, as I'll show, the history of the term, it sort of builds on other concepts, and it goes much further back, and involves drawing from and building upon much older medical and environmental traditions. If we go to the next slide, please. Now, if you're interested, Warwick Anderson and James Dunk, I've put this up on the slide here, have published some really useful work about the history of the term, a genealogy of the term, and they focus on people like Tony McMichael, his work in the late 80s onwards. But however, we're sort of putting together my concept, my comments. I didn't want to simply replicate what these authors say, as good as it was. And I was sort of wondering how I might chart a different path. If I go to the next slide, please. And what I settled on was in some ways to follow the money. As many of you will know, the 2015 report on planetary health was jointly published by the Lancet, of course, and also the Rockefeller Foundation. And of course, as many of you also know, the Rockefeller Foundation has a very long history in global health projects. And the presence of the Rockefeller Foundation, or the RF, as I will call it for the remainder of my time, is particularly interesting. It's hard to get exact figures, but I think they've allocated about $15 million, so what I can see, to establish and advance this new discipline of planetary health. And what I want to do is to follow the RF as a means of tracing then where planetary health came from. And doing so, I think, allows us to trace a bit of a kind of different genealogy of this term. Now, by focusing on the RF, I'm not trying to sort of do a gotcha thing or make judgments about the quality of the research that it funds. Indeed, as you'll see, I myself have received money from the RF when I was researching my own book on the history of the NHS, but rather I'm interested in using the RF then as a vehicle to open up these broader questions about the antecedents of planetary health, and in particular the role of philanthropy and charitable foundations in advancing such things. And to do this, I'm going to very quickly blow through 4 moments in the RF's history to give you a bit of a sense of these earlier ideas of environment and health that I think planetary health draws from. The next slide, please. So first, the beginnings. Founded in 1913, the RF became one of the 20th century's most important philanthropic organizations. It channeled a massive endowment by the founder of Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller, into a wide variety of fellowships, programs, and projects across both the arts and the sciences. This included medicine. During the interwar years, as you can see on the slide here, the RF's International Health Division, or its IHD, stood at the vanguard of public health efforts around the world. And in terms of its approach, the RF harnessed the power of the bacteriological revolution, which was relatively recent, which broadly speaking has sort of coalesced during the late 19th century, led by figures such as Robert Koch, and involved identifying specific microorganisms that cause disease and then eradicating them. So you get, the RF had the money and really the political clout to launch these kind of massive disease eradication campaigns, beginning with a campaign against hookworm in the US South in 1909, but then in other parts of the world, such as yellow fever and malaria campaigns in Mexico between the 1920s and the 1950s. So a point then we might, if we start to think about these concepts of environment and health and the relationship and the balance between the two, a point we might make it here is that at its inception of the RF, in the early 20th century moment, like many other leading figures in organizations in the medical world, the RF was not especially interested in the relationship between environment and health. As the prominent historian of medicine, Charles Rosenberg, has influentially argued, this prioritization of bacteriology above everything else actually tended to push questions of the environment to the margins. So that synthesis then of health and environment is not something that's always been there. In the view of organizations like the RF, good health could be best ensured by focusing on those individual germs and parasites and eradicating the vectors through which they spread. Next slide, please. In the mid-20th century, this began to change. After the Second World War, the RF had to shift its role in the international health landscape, especially given the formation of the World Health Organization after the Second World War. So there was kind of a lot of reprioritization. And in addition, leading figures within the RF began to rethink the organization's approach to health. From the 1940s until about the 1960s, the RF embraced something called social medicine. Still around today, what is social medicine? Well, social medicine is a tradition that insists in simple terms of treating patients within a wider social and economic context. This was an approach pioneered by a wide variety of medical practitioners like René Sand in Belgium, Angira Stampa in Croatia, Sir John Ryle in the UK, and Sydney and Emily Clark in South Africa. And the RF funded a great many social medicine initiatives, and they were particularly interested in health centres as models like this one, where you could bring together a wide variety of medical professionals and be attuned to those wider social and economic contexts. The next slide, please. And this led them to some surprising places, like funding health centres in the early NHS, which as a system they were particularly interested in, and I've written about that in the past, if you're interested in following up on that lead. So social medicine then, it sounds familiar, perhaps even obvious, but if we think back to that dominant germ theory approach at the start of the RF's involvement in medicine, you can see how this kind of approach represented a break from the past. Indeed, its proponents often presented it as a superior alternative to the bacteriological model of treating disease, and this is because it considered what we might call a wider environment. But they didn't use this word. Indeed, environment was rarely used as a term in our understanding until the 1960s. But there was at this moment a rising interest in wider surroundings in social medicine and a concern with economy and inequalities. And these are points of emphasis, of course, that the report Planetary Health itself also brings out. However, social medicine was not infused with any ecological thinking. It was more of a kind of social democratic, class-based politics to it. And a more recognisable idea of environment would have to wait until the 60s and 70s. Next slide, please. Various historians have identified the rise of, will be familiar to you, of a new environmental consciousness in the 1960s to the 1970s. One can think about the formation of groups like Friends of the Earth, the establishments of departments of the environment in various countries, and of course the 1972 Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment. The environmental movement of these years, so we're at the 60s and 70s here, identified various threats to what was now referred to variously as the biosphere or the ecosystem, including deforestation, pollution, and toxicity. Many of these ills, again, are similarly named in the report of the Planetary Health Commission. So what then did this rise of environmental thinking mean for health? Now, there were various implications. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, for example, identified the insidious damage that pesticides and nuclear testing was kind of invisible threat was causing to human health. So there was a lot of new thinking about toxicity. But as the historians Paul Ward, Libby Robin, and Sverker Sorlin have argued, at the heart of a great deal of thinking about the environment in the 60s and 70s was the question of population. And to be more specific, anxieties about overpopulation, a phrase that I will use in inverted commas. In best-selling environmentalist texts like Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, which was published in 1968, the planet was seemingly under threat by a kind of endless tide of human numbers, which was then linked to resource scarcity. So in short, more people led to expanded urbanization, more pollution, higher consumption, and so on. So an important thing to keep in mind then is that this was before a widespread acceptance of the link between burning fossil fuels and global heating, so issues like population were much more prominent in environmentalist circles. And the RF itself is very influenced by this line of thinking and established bodies like the Population Council, which was founded by John D. Rockefeller III, and kind of funded contraceptive devices and services in countries with high birth rates, like India, South Korea on the slide, and Taiwan. So this then was a medical solution to a looming environmental crisis. And in RF's views, these strategies would help solve a larger problem of human ecology, where too many people were chasing too few resources. Next slide, please. It's coming towards the end now. At the same time, and also relevant to health, the RF funded projects in the Global South that sought to maximize crop yields, things like rice or wheat, in order to better feed the people that were being born. And this moment is often referred to as the Green Revolution and involved applying the techniques of high technology agriculture, including machines like tractors, genetically modified seeds, and high levels of pesticides. So just to cap this section off before I close with the present, I want to make clear that this particular intertwining of the environment with various health issues, whether that's population, whether that's nutrition, or those kinds of things, was highly controversial. And indeed, the RF itself, if you go on its website, is very open about how criticised some of the projects it funded became. As you will know, the population control campaigns of the 60s and 70s were highly paternalistic, racialized, and usually laid the blame for the population crisis on women. And they also led to lots of forced procedures as well. And similarly, the agricultural campaigns at this moment boosted crops, averted a lot of hunger, but they did lead to a high degree of soil erosion and toxicity through pesticide use, which, interestingly, the 2015 Planetary Health Report also identifies as a threat. So there's an interesting irony here, where this earlier intertwining of health and environment, where the RF was deeply implicated, led to effects which the organisation would later seek to address. So just to finish then, the next slide please, just to conclude with the present, I've been talking very a whistle-stop tour through the antecedents of planetary health. So that kind of thinking about bacteriology, pushing out the environment, social medicine, maybe bringing it back in, an environmentalist moment of the 60s and the 70s, and of course now we have this different sort of tradition in planetary health. But of course there is a lot new in this new concept of planetary health. And an obviously new thing is the centrality of a concern with the climate and global heating. This is different to the earlier medico-environmental traditions that I've been discussing. Planetary health in its current form, I think, could only really come into being in a post-1980s landscape, where concerns with the climate have moved to the centre of what the environment means. But that said, this term isn't just about the climate, and I think that's a really wonderful thing about the report. It takes the environment in a wider sense. And relatedly, another one of the novel things to me with planetary health as a category is its synthesis of environmental systems theory, so things like the planetary boundary theory, which was first put forward in 2009 by the scientist Johan Rockström, with health, and that seems novel and also valuable. So to close then, just a couple of questions that I think the other papers are going to pick up on. I think there's a lot novel. I think there are obviously traditions, as I've said, that planetary health is building upon, but also maybe thinking about some of the risks inherent in the focus on planetary in planetary health. Can this scaling up on literally the biggest frame of all, planetary, perhaps make its goals seem overwhelming? How can it be actioned and communicated on a local level? How can communities be brought into a category that soars above them? Perhaps part of this answer might also involve looking to the past and thinking about the successes and failures of older projects that fused environment and health. Can, for example, its practitioners keep in mind the advantages of the everyday personal approach of social medicine? Can the blind spots and the darker underbelly of the 1960s and 1970s environmentalism, funded, as we've seen, by some of the same organisations, be avoided? And these are all questions that history can help illuminate, and I'm sure we'll talk about in the discussion. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great, Andrew, for starting us off, and I'm sure everybody's kind of brimming with questions, but just hold them until we have our discussion at the end. But we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Marina Romanello, who is Executive Director of UCL Lancet Countdown, an independent multidisciplinary research collaboration with almost 100 academic centres around the world and headquartered at UCL Institute of Global Health.
Thank you.
Where do you want to...
I'll go around.
Yep. Do you want... You can take that if you want and stand with it, and then you can do your slides. That would work, if that works for you.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for coming along. So I'm going to share with you kind of very briefly some of the work that we do with Lancet Countdown, that is a big research collaboration that is based here at UCL, at the Institute for Global Health. And basically, we bring together about 127 collaboration institutions around the world through our kind of global and then 6 regional centers. And what we do is we look at the intersection between climate change and health with the approach of kind of putting health at the center of the climate change conversation and trying to kind of reward or convert the conversation on climate change to be centered around people and around how climate change is affecting our health, but most importantly, how the actions that we need to take to address climate change could actually be transformative also for global and public health. What we do is every year we publish these reports that you see on screen in the Lancet. The report this year is actually coming up next week, which means that I've been forbidden from sharing any data. So it's slightly outdated. It has the same indicators every year. So what you will see now, probably we have 1 year of data that will come up next week. But if you do want to tune in for that, we're going to launch it on next Wednesday, actually, in a week's time. But basically, we publish these indicators around this time of the year every year because we have COP happening in 1 week and a half. So we try to make it, or what we can have after we launch, we try to make it such that the data in these kind of over 60 indicators is available ahead of COP. And we put a lot of effort also in translating that data and those indicators into kind of policy products and country level, what they mean for different countries, etc. And we work on indicators, which is quite reductive. If you have ever worked on indicators, it's probably the most frustrating thing to work on because it's one piece of data. In our case, it has to be globally representative, it has to be updatable year on year, and it has to tell a bigger story than that number. So they're always proxies in a way of what's happening, of something bigger that's happening. But they're really useful as a set of 60 because altogether they do paint a pretty comprehensive picture of climate change and health. So these are the indicators, each of them plotted there in a row, for which we monitor kind of the health risks, the health impacts of climate change across different dimensions. You have things like heat-related mortality, heat stress, infectious disease risk, incidence of droughts and floods and extreme weather events, and kind of food insecurity risk and things of the like. So it's a bit of everything. But put all together and plotted such that the bluer colors are conditions that are more favorable to health, and the redder colors, conditions that are most harmful to health, you can see a very clear trend across all of them, in that every dimension that we monitor is showing the health threats of climate change are increasing pretty rapidly. And in fact, out of the 15 indicators which we monitored, last year about 10 reached new records. For the new year of data, it's about 20 different indicators, and about 13 of them reached a new record, yet again, in the level of data. So these numbers have already been surpassed in the latest year of data. The other thing that we look at is kind of what is driving this. And obviously, greenhouse gas emissions are driving what we know is an unprecedented pace of change in the climate, is driving the world to the hottest global mean temperature that human beings have ever experienced in the history of human beings' existence. And we know that the vast majority of these greenhouse gases accumulated in the atmosphere came from the burning of fossil fuels, the very, very vast majority of them. Looking at fossil fuel burning, it's mainly done for energy generation in every form of energy that we consume, and that's what we're looking at here. Kind of the graph that you have there on the left shows you the greenhouse gas emissions that come from energy generation, and we have reached kind of record high levels in 2022. The new report shows also in 2023, and actually the IEA published data, or the World Meteorological Organization published data showing that 2023 once again was a record high year of emissions. So far from the UNFCCC's agreement signed in 1992 to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference on the climate system by limiting greenhouse gas emissions, we keep on increasing the greenhouse gas emissions year on year without much effort in terms of reduction of those emissions. We haven't yet managed to bend the curve. We have absolutely not managed to get anywhere close to the net zero emissions that we need by mid-century for the world to remain slightly survivable. You can see there on the graph on the right, though, that the percentage of renewable energy generation is growing globally, and it's growing particularly rapidly in some of the higher income countries around the world. What that graph also tells you is that the two regions that are worst affected by climate change, that is Africa and small island developing states, are lagging behind in the adoption of clean renewable energy. And this is not an energy conversation, this is a health conversation. This is a health conversation because energy is a health service. We cannot have good health, good well-being in most of our modern societies if we don't have good, reliable access to clean energy. So that is not happening at the moment, and what you can see in this graph is kind of where the household energy used around the world comes from. And by and large, as you see there, the vast majority of energy used in Africa comes from biomass and waste burning. Unreliable sources of energy, that mean that people don't have electricity in their homes, cannot just click on a switch and have access to electricity, often don't have access to communication services either. So it's quite isolating, they don't have access to early warning systems. Many times this kind of biomass for heating, for lighting, is collected by women and girls, generally, putting them at risk of harm, of violence, and keeping them away from the workforce and from education. So a huge gender and intergenerational justice issue as well. About 2.4 billion people still rely on dirty fuels and technologies globally, and about 1 billion people around the world access healthcare facilities that do not have reliable electricity, which means that you cannot have an incubator, you cannot operate, you cannot have a functional operating theater, you cannot sterilize things if you don't have access to energy. Generally, that comes from the burning of fossil fuels that is quite expensive, like diesel generators, highly polluting, very unreliable, and very, very expensive. What this also means is that in the burning of dirty fuels inside people's homes, that is leading to very, very high levels of household air pollution, particularly in the poorest parts of the world. You can see the kind of numbers on screen, about 2.3 million total deaths in the 65 countries that mostly rely on biomass and dirty fuels for household energy needs. And you can see also there a big inequality in terms of rural-urban divide, with rural households generally worst affected by lack of access to reliable electricity and high levels of household air pollution. Going to the other kind of one of the biggest emitting systems and one of the biggest drivers of climate breakdown is the agricultural sector. The agricultural sector is responsible for about 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions, and the vast majority of the deforestation, about 1/3 of the deforestation, also has to do with agricultural systems. The most land and kind of resource-consuming aspect of the agricultural system is anything having to do with animal rearing. It takes a lot of land, not only because the animals themselves take land, but also because the food that we feed those animals takes a lot of land. And the other thing is, particularly the generation of red meat that comes from ruminants is also one of the biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions, because ruminant fermentation produces greenhouse gas emissions in the form of methane that is a really high kind of warming gas. It's one of the highest, one of the highest warming gases. Which means that that ruminant meat generation is still one of the biggest drivers globally of agricultural-related emissions. About 56% or so are from red meat and dairy production. The flip side of that is that the overconsumption of these products that contribute mostly to greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector are also driving a huge burden of disease globally. We know that the excess consumption of red meat and saturated fats is one of the main drivers of ill health, particularly in very industrialized countries, but increasingly also in less industrialized countries, or in countries so-called developing under the Anthropocene, which generally don't have the center of attention when it comes to mitigation efforts. And what you can see there in the graph on the right is the estimation that we have of dietary deaths, diet-related deaths that come from high emission diets, from diets that and kind of risk factors that could be avoided by transitioning to healthier and lower emission diets. The Eat Lancet Commission was published last week, showed something really similar. We estimate about 11.2, I think it's 11.8 this year. They estimate about 15 million deaths that could be saved through the so-called Eat Lancet or Planetary diet. That is a diet that optimizes health and planetary benefits. So also there a huge area where we have big opportunities for life saves through the transition to healthier and more environmentally friendly food systems. And I was talking a bit about land use change as well. Aside from kind of our active greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural, from energy sectors, we're also removing the world's capacity to absorb the extra greenhouse gases that we can continue to emit. In terms of tree cover loss, we monitor these with satellites, so it's all mostly based on remote sensing, so we have a pretty kind of live or real-time monitoring of tree cover. And as you can see there, tree cover loss is increasing year on year. The surface area covered by trees is falling very rapidly. The greenhouse gas of the deforestation per year is dropping slightly, but we still have very high levels of deforestation, which means that the total cover of trees continues to fall globally. When you look at the drivers of this forestry, the main driver, but the second biggest driver is the land use change that comes from agricultural shifts. And as I said, kind of animal farming is one of the biggest sources of land use change because they're so energy intensive and so land cover expensive to rear. one thing that we always like to draw the attention to is kind of some of the drivers or some of the perpetuators of the current system. That comes from our kind of energy pricing, particularly in Europe and in the UK, but also our subsidizing of fossil fuels. When the energy prices spiked after the war in Ukraine, countries kind of had no choice but to increase the subsidies to keep energy affordable, because we still are so reliant on fossil fuels. And what that looked like is 1.4 trillion US dollars in net total globally dedicated to fossil fuel subsidies, often from taxpayers' funds. This keeps energy affordable and perpetuates the need to access fossil fuel-based energies. And obviously it takes resources away from our health system, from our land conservation, from any other activity that benefits human health and well-being. So one of the big issues that we're seeing there. We hear a lot that it's too technologically difficult, that there's not enough money, that it's too costly, but we do have the technology. We know that it's not being kind of upscaled enough, and it's not being delivered to people that could benefit from it the most when it comes to renewable energy. We know that we have the funds. We find kind of 1.4 trillion in 1 year to subsidize fossil fuels, and we haven't managed to commit to even more than 300 billion in terms of supporting a just transition for low and middle-income countries. So we know that it's not a financial issue either. It's just basically a political issue that we have, and the lack of awareness of the close links between environmental destruction and their own health and well-being. So with that, I'll finish up there.
Thank you very much.
I should have said that the link, if you want to join the event next week, is on our website, but I forgot to put it there. If you go to lancecanton.org, you'll find it.
Great, thank you. Some very sobering slides, I think. But we'll move on, and we stay with questions of practice now also, and delighted that Linda Thompson is here, who's a Senior Research Fellow in Health Inequalities based at UCL Arts and Humanities. So welcome, Linda. And I don't know if you want to do your slides yourself, is that?
Yes.
Yes, great. I think they should be just the next set.
Hello everyone. So I'd like to share with you a study I carried out last year, which was published at the beginning of this year, and I've put the reference for that right at the end if anybody does want to read it in full, but I'll try and give you a synopsis here. So I was keen to look at what the key features were of environmentally and socially engaged community programs. And these programs described that they intersected the challenges of planetary and human health. So that's why I called the talk this title. So the aim of my research was to identify which the key features were of both environmentally and socially engaged community programs. And I got in touch with creative health practitioners working in the UK who were offering community programs. These included all sorts of activities which could be described as creative and cultural. So they were arts and health, various therapies, mindfulness, walking in green spaces, wild swimming, what haven't I said? Meditation, various crafts activities to do with plants, growing and cultivating their own food, and various practices. We meditation, various crafts activities to do with plants, growing and cultivating their own food, and various practices. We got in touch through the Centre for Culture, Health and Wellbeing with 73 organisations and almost as many freelancers who were working in this field of creative health, arts and health, and participatory arts. So despite 73 organisations and the purposeful snowball sampling, where we're asking people to contact anybody else they knew working in the same field, we in fact ended up with 19 surveys and 8 in-depth interviews. The reason being that although quite a lot of people profess to actually include planetary health in their therapies or in their activities, in their sessions, when it came down to the survey, very few of them actually really did take into account the environment. A lot of people did something quite superficial, like I said, they always recycled their paper or used green products, you know, for washing up liquid and things, but very few actually were looking at both the environment and the human aspects of well-being. So those which we had took part in an online survey with 5 questions, and 8 of 19 people who we selected then took part in an interview of about an hour. We were asking them what sort of practices, why they thought their work did improve the environment, and really the questions were quite open, and it gave them a chance to discuss with us the sort of work they were doing and how in their own minds they associated the two, human health and planetary health. And the thematic analysis looked at 146 different types of response, and from that we derived 12 themes and 98 sub-themes. Now, nearly 3/4 of these responses actually came from 5 out of the 12 themes, which you've got listed here: collaboration and partnerships, community health and well-being, connection to nature, funding, and mental health. So we looked at those sub-themes where participants had had mentioned it several times themselves, but where 3 or more participants had mentioned the same or similar things. So if one person just kept repeating what they did, we only counted that once, but if several people talked about one of the themes or sub-themes, then that was included in. So what we ended up with were 2 sub-themes out of the 10, which actually address planetary and human health directly. They're the green ones on the figure. So connection to nature, 2 of the aspects of connection to nature were connection to nature and children and our relationship with the natural world. So we could say that if they took these sub-themes into account in their work, they were attempting to address planetary health and human health directly. And then there were some other themes which addressed both aspects indirectly. So one was the blue one, influencing wider systems, under the larger theme of collaboration and partnerships. Bear in mind there were other sub-themes as well under collaboration and partnerships. And there were 3 sub-themes under the theme of mental health, looking after our staff, preventative measures and research evidence. And these all appeared to address planetary and human health a little bit more indirectly, and with influence in wider systems, practitioners talked about the influence of partnerships with other practitioners and how they could affect policy related to climate change. And those working with people with mental ill health were also indirectly addressing planetary health because of their concern for the environment manifesting in eco-anxiety. So although I haven't actually gone into it on the slide, people already experiencing mental health issues are more likely also to feel eco-anxiety about the environment and about the planet more strongly, is likely to impact more upon them. So in dealing with people with eco-anxiety, they were attempting to indirectly address both the planet and human health. So I've just put in a few quotations in connection to nature, the green ones. Most people, particularly those working with young people, had an overriding ambition to get children and young people more out into nature. And in terms of adult relationships with nature, they talked about the importance, the lower green one, of not only having relationships with people, but relationships with nature and the earth. And in fact, how the relationship with nature could bring about social relationships with people, and people finding things in common in nature. And then in terms of collaboration and partnership, they talked about forming groups, as you can see here from the quote, to influence wider systems. And then for mental health, they talked about system change, becoming more preventative, and the 10-year health plan, the new one, is obviously keen also on prevention rather than cure, in that not that people won't be cured, but the idea would be in the future to be more preventative and to use community assets to help to provide that prevention. So they also pointed out top right how young people who spend more time in green spaces may experience depression less in adult life. And something else which practitioners pointed out, which I was sort of surprised about, they talked quite a bit about looking after themselves and looking after their own staff, in saying that when they're working with people with mental illnesses, it could be very draining for them, and they had to ensure that they were mindful to look after everyone around them working in that field as well. So, before anybody else puts it out, I thought I'd better point out that obviously there were a number of limitations with the study. We did have a restricted number of creative health practitioners because although we contacted a lot of organisations and received a lot of surveys, the majority of them weren't working on both environmentally and socially engaged programmes. They were socially engaged, but not very heavily environmentally engaged. It was also interesting that 7 out of 8 practitioners were female, and I did look up the diversity statistics for creative health, and it appeared, in fact, that across the board, nearly 90% were female, and the references at the bottom tang. So at least our findings fitted in with that of the statistics for diversity. We didn't obtain any demographic data, so we didn't compare age or ethnicity. One of the things that came out quite strongly from practitioners, which doesn't particularly feed into planetary health, so I haven't gone into it here, was the lack of funding and the unreliability of funding. A lot of the funding they regarded as very precarious, short-term. They carried out a lot of pilot projects, but there were never any long-term funded real projects. So they said that without any funding, they weren't able to carry out formal evaluation. They found it challenging and they couldn't afford for anybody else to do it. So in interpreting their interviews, we needed to take basically what they had said at face value, which is in keeping with an interpretivist epistemology. We've just taken what they've said and analysed it. So, obviously, knowing what we knew about creative health and planetary health, it may have predisposed us to certain conclusions. So that's the limitations. The conclusions from the study did highlight the need for inclusive practice, sustainable funding, and environment-based health interventions. Though it did draw attention to practitioners' socially determined views of health and their desire to work collaboratively and share resources, we're hoping the results could be utilised by commissioners and funders to better understand connections between human and planetary health and actually put funding in place to support these. And we believe it is pretty likely that creativity and culture are both currently under-tapped resources to tackle environmental issues and health inequalities. The potential hasn't really been fully realised yet. In terms of recommendations, we think planetary health needs to be integrated into practice, advocacy and leadership, with a view to safeguarding the environment. It needs to be embedded in education, and we do need to do more to acknowledge indigenous wisdom, and we would like to integrate indigenous knowledge into Western education and find transformative solutions. And when we mentioned this before, somebody asked the question, said, well, how are you going to actually achieve that? And the answer is we don't know, but we've had two master's students from arts and sciences working on this. Someone did a project last year in Canada with Indigenous peoples, and we have somebody else who will be doing a project looking at how solutions can be applied to Western health and medicine. But though we acknowledge that we should be looking at more global views of health and the environment, we're not quite sure how we will integrate those yet. We think policymakers do need to be advised on the impacts of planetary health in some way, usually through policy briefings. We'd like more creative health practitioners and healthcare practitioners to deliver care through a planetary health lens and use their expertise to address planetary health stresses. We'd like to minimise negative impact on the planet and ask people to commit to sustainable practices and collaborate with experts and other organisations to actively engage in advocacy and policy related to public health. So, thank you all for listening. If you'd like to read the article in full, it's there. And just to say that our planetary health research is part of a larger funded programme of research mobilising community assets to tackle health inequalities, which has brought academics, community organisations, health and care systems and people with lived experience together to explore the system change to support community-based approaches to health equity. So that's where I'm coming from in planetary health in terms of addressing health equities. But we are, as I said, planning more research, and at the moment I'm personally looking at a set of case studies from health practitioners. So that's it from me.
Great, thank you very much. Very interesting study, thank you so much. Our next speaker is Mariam Motamedi-Fraser, who's a senior research fellow based in geography here at UCL, who works in the field of animal studies with specific interest in how epistemologies and methodologies for animal science and the politics of animal-human relations.
Okay. So, like One Health, the Rockefeller Foundation Lancet Commission views animals' lives and deaths primarily as a means to the ends of human health. We know this, so I'm not going to say anything more about it. I'm also not going to say much about the how animals are impacted by the polycrisis in a conventional sense. These are just some of the ways. It's hugely important, all of these things. But I just want to step back for a minute and think about how animals are impacted by the framing of the crisis in terms of ecology, which is where the concept of planetary health is firmly located. And I think that article that you pulled up, Andrew, describes this as third wave of disease ecology. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to be drawing on Benson's very thoughtful account of the different ways the relation between an organism and its surroundings has been historically imagined as an object, and also on questions posed by Monica Greco throughout her career regarding what values we associate with health, and therefore what values we promote and defend in the name of health. So I'm going to kind of gallop through the framing part and then slow down for the more interesting implications. So animals are framed, I'd say, mainly in three ways in ecological discourses at the moment. First as species. For a whole number of reasons, species is central to the way that animal life is organised in the context of anthropogenic crisis. Species extinction rates, for example, are a key measure of environmental health or ill health, which has led taxonomic decisions taxonomic decisions have become hugely political. They can alter conservation priorities, resource allocation, and even the perceived scale and urgency of the crisis. So there's a lot in it, hanging on it for animals. Yet an animal, I just want to say, is not a species. A species does not act, does not give its consent, doesn't contribute an opinion, and it doesn't resist. Animals are also framed as data points. Equipped with sensors, scientists are able to map changes in animals' behaviours, physiology, and distribution onto spreading diseases, ecosystemic health, and climate change impacts. That's a lot of behavioural data, and for sure biologging has thrown up some genuinely interesting questions about animal behaviours. The conceptual tools for understanding these surprises, though, are often reductive. Animal behaviours are nearly always explained with reference to isolated variables, genetics, mechanistic patterns of behaviour, changes in causality, and so on. And I'm hoping to work with Martin Fikelski, who's a leader in biologging, on that problem. Finally, animals are also very often framed as ecosystem components. And it's not just that animals provide ecosystem services, and I note that this term, ecosystem services, is almost never now put in inverted commas anymore. It's not just that they provide ecosystem services. More recently, animals have been identified as cost-efficient, no-tech vehicles for carbon capture and storage. In other words, animals can actively remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and sequester CO2 in marine, freshwater, and terrestrial sinks. And this report makes for very persuasive reading because it compares animal carbon capture and storage against anthropogenic carbon emissions. So I've put the quote there. And it describes animals as climate heroes. But on what grounds are animals climate heroes? When scientists turn to animals to supercharge climate mitigation, they do so on the basis that animals breathe, eat, excrete, move, and die. And it's true across all the three framings that I've discussed. It's not animals as subjects who bear on planetary crisis, but animals as physical objects driven by the most basic bodily needs. So Just One Health is a kind of emerging framework that responds to criticisms of One Health by centering justice, equality, animal agency, animal rights, indigenous knowledges, indigenous epistemologies, not animal epistemologies. And we could extend that concept, all of those kinds of things, to the concept of planetary health as well. And this is what advocacy, I think, for animals within an ecological model currently looks like. But I think it's also important to just reflect for a moment on the ecological model itself, because ecology for animals is a very different thing than ecology for humans. So today, biology is a disciplinary home of ecology. And this is significant because unlike animals, unlike humans, animals have no escape from biology. Culture, for example, for humans is an escape from biological determinism. Animals too, lately, have been said to have culture. But where humans are considered cultural beings, animals' cultures are often reduced to exceptional units of behaviour. So like this example of blue tits opening milk bottle tops in the UK, it's an exceptional cultural behaviour within an otherwise static species repertoire. And the point is also relevant to time. Humans exempt themselves from evolutionary time through cultural time, historical time, political time. Time is rarely considered, though, to be a material factor in animals' lives. Instead, as in the blue tit example, any differences between animals identified as the same species are usually explained with reference to space, to a diversity of environments understood as the locus of differentiation. So the ecological niche basically limits human conceptions of animal transformation, invention, and difference. Before ecology is biological, it's more fundamentally relational, and from about the early 1900s, 20s, 30s, 40s onwards, systemic. Yet relationality doesn't necessarily serve animals well in practice, not at the macro level, as I've just been talking about, nor necessarily at the micro level. So if you consider just one quick example, evolutionary developmental biology, Evo-Devo, or more recently, Eco-Evo-Devo, the symbiotic model at the heart of the Evo-Devo has been embraced by many social and cultural theorists, not least because it seemingly offers empirical proof that the autonomous bounded Cartesian self is a fiction. And this point is not lost on Scott Gilbert, who's closely associated with Evo-Devo, who has an MA in the history of science. In an article entitled "We've Never Been Individuals," subtitled "We've Never Been Individuals," Gilbert explains that organisms don't simply exist within environments, but also are environments for other organisms, bacteria say. Supporting evidence for the now widespread claim in the social sciences and humanities that the world can't be easily divided between autonomous organisms and their environments. The title of the article, "We've Never Been Individuals," touches me particularly because it could be understood so differently. It could be understood not as humans disputing what humans are, but as animals describing how humans have nearly always conceived of them. We have never been individuals, they might protest. From an animal perspective, relationality is just the same story, differently told. I want to apologise for ventriloquising and anthropomorphising. My point is just this. The relationship between relationality, be it ontological or biological, and experience is undecided. To whom does relationality matter? At what scale? Under what circumstances? What histories have led us to embrace relationality as the answer to complex ethical and political questions? Animals have no choice but to be in relations with humans. We are their environment. Do they welcome these relations? There's a lot of evidence showing that animals actively change their behaviours to avoid us, that they might even actually not like us. And indeed, histories of ecologies are characterised as much by antagonism as by Christian harmony, which is where Kochia locates the roots of Western ecology. So all in all, basically, what I'm trying to say is I think it might be worth slowing down and interrogating not just how relationality describes the empirical conditions of and for planetary health, but what it means in the pursuit of planetary health. and the slime.
Thank you very much, Marianne. And we go to our final presenter today, who's Jenny Gamlin, who is an Associate Professor in Anthropology at the Institute of Global Health, and who's been engaged in long-term research on structural violence, environmental crisis, health and colonialism, working in Latin America, and specifically with Mexican indigenous populations.
Hi everybody, thanks for waiting. Glad you're still here. I'm going to change my glasses. Okay, so I'll try and whiz through so we've got time for some discussion. Does planetary health need the rights of nature? So I was asked to talk about rights of nature, which is something I've been thinking about more theoretically than in practice to date. And I want to sort of interrogate this concept from a feminist post-human standpoint and from a human rights perspective, and considering the views of indigenous communities and populations who have been working with for a long time. So what is life and what does it mean to be human? This picks up really well from Mariam's presentation. These are questions we could start by asking before interrogating the rights of nature proposal. In his book, Is a River Alive?, Robert Macfarlane suggests that perhaps the question should not be, is a river alive, but what is life? And I wonder if all life requires water, for example, then is water life? So I'll be using water throughout the presentation to talk about nature. Rosa Braidotti puts a similar question to the human, suggesting that none of us can say with any degree of certainty that we've always been human, while Astrida Neymanis, author of Bodies of Water, suggests that perhaps we could remind ourselves that we too are dirt made flesh, iron made blood, water made tears, and sweat made urine. So what is this about? What's the rights of nature about in these Anthropocene times? So I want to just very briefly, this is actually an image from the Ecuadorian Constitution, which many of you may know was the first constitution to actually establish the rights of nature within them, within their, I think it's Article 10 here, so persons have the fundamental rights guaranteed in this constitution and the international human rights instruments, and the rights of nature has the same rights as persons. So rights of nature are basically a recognition that ecosystems have rights just as human beings do. So ecosystems can become subjects with rights. They argue that nature has the right to exist, persist, maintain and regenerate its vital cycles and acknowledge the deep connection between humans and nature. They have potential for use by national and global entities, such as the UN, to guarantee the rights of nature and establish the legal basis for this, with a formal binding UN treaty perhaps being the ultimate goal. In practice, though, they are rights that must be viewed within the same framework as, for example, corporate rights or human rights. So I want to problematize these rights from that last point. So the rights of nature raises a series of contradictions and foundational or conceptual problems or dilemmas that need to be made present in discussions, even if only to say, stay with the trouble, as Haraway would argue, or to think about what comes out of this friction in Anna Singh's terms. So human rights are seated within anthropocentrism, and this creates a complex call for action for indigenous people, for example, many of whom see themselves as part of nature. Implicit in the rights of nature is the Cartesian separation of humans and nature, culture and nature. Both colonizers and colonized have largely learned and come to see the world in this way, through this separation. Rights of nature are based on the liberal human rights framework, hence, they don't challenge the coloniality of being, the sort of essential colonial idea of what it means to be human, or the hierarchical dualisms that go with that and that follow on from that. On the other hand, they are problematic from an anthropocentric or a humanist standpoint. For a world faced with feeding the global population, its population, for example, depends on water. So if there to be rights of water, then these, the sort of anthropocentric humanist position on human rights might challenge the rights of those of nature to be independent of the needs of humans, for example.
They're also problematic from a capitalist point of view, where growth and income generation are needed for human survival or technological change, as well as the management of a transition to a low carbon future. So for the rest of this talk, I want to address the first of these, the problematizations relating to human exceptionalism and what that means for the rights of nature, and what the rights of nature are if we think about and critique human exceptionalism. So basically, human rights are aligned with capitalist rights-based framework, a sort of liberal, this is a liberal sort of legal tradition. That's fairly established in law, that this is the basis of our human rights. And hence they're linked to very sort of very positivist, this ideas of human exceptionalism and hierarchies that have come to be very much sort of the subject of deconstruction through decolonization, for example, but human rights hasn't undergone this process yet. So this means they work with the construction of a specific human that comprises, this is Anna Greer's words, two separate parts: the conceptual disembodiment, as in the separation of mind and body, and a separation from nature and society. So that's the conception of the human that's the basis that's used in human rights. Corporate rights also map onto a human rights framework where corporations take on legal personhood. And then, so the rights of nature then follows these framings. Thinking about the destruction of the mind-body separation, again, to quote Bradotti, I think, therefore I am in the Cartesian dualism. Disembodiment through language, so what does that disembodiment look like? Disembodiment through language that reproduces the idea that experience is disembodied of the mind, and hence of this relationality. So if mind and body are separated and disembodied, this experience is then separated also from the body. And language transmits from the head the experience rather than from the body. And I'll come back to language in a minute. So the other is enabling and reproducing this human nature separation, where nature is a resource for exploitation. So this separation, the mind-body separation is reproduced into this human nature separation. And you have this essentialization, for example, an offshoot of that, essentialization with nature relationships, when in fact, if you look at non-Western and pre-colonial societies, what you see is that both men and women had a similar relationship with nature. So it wasn't, but again, the human nature, the women nature essentialization takes you down a whole other route of other hierarchies that come into play. So this is sort of the frame on which the rights of nature is based, is this sort of basic human rights frame. So language and relationality, which I seem to have lost. I'm very good at doing it. There's a lot of work about Indigenous communities which talks about what comes out in their languages. There's a lot been done in recent years. Lots of this has been built on, particularly in Latin America. I just want to point to a couple here. One of them is the work of Carlos Lenkersdorf on intersubjectivity, who interestingly actually was sort of one of the first books I read about Indigenous cultures back in the 1990s in Mexico. He was actually a German philosopher who ended up living in a Zapatista community at the time of the uprising and then was expelled from there. But he did something very interesting, which was to go into a Mayan community before that language was written, to learn the language and then to write the language on the basis of the linguistic structures in that community. So he taught the community how to write their language, which is Toholabal, and he did it by understanding that enough about that language that he didn't have to rely on Western structures of language. And this is really important because what he sees is this intersubjectivity, that how people relate to each other, and you can see in the language, and that his whole sort of the whole central argument he makes is that the whole of our language is intersubjective, and that's replicated in relationships between people and animals, between people and objects, etc. Some of you may know the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer, who talks about the grammar of animacy, and how animacy through verbs, plants, etc. is central. She says 70% of the language is animate, as in they are verbs rather than nouns. I failed here to put on the language which she's referring to, but it's North American. So yeah, there's lots of examples of indigenous communities of how language expresses a different type of relationality with the natural environment. And interestingly, post-humanism has tapped into similar ideas and expresses similar ideas in different ways. And so Astridis Neymans has done this work on water, which is very, very interesting, and talks about sort of water and human as both human as cultural constructs. Drawing on Linton, she emphasises how this concept of modern water, which is actually Linton's idea, came about with the rise of the modern state. So how we understand and conceive of water, again, has been sort of colonised to create this one unifying idea of water as a resource. We might ask, for example, if nature thinks and it's literate and produces patterns and meanings and expresses sociality and intelligence, and examples of that might be, for example, a glacier's long-term memory, the social promiscuity of body fluids, the river riding the canyon in a slow motion cursive script. So these are just other ways of thinking about water, which take us away from that idea of modern water and into the critiques. And these are some other concepts which have been developed by a variety of post-human feminists, talking about how we might think about that relationship between humans and animals. Haraway was nature culture, says that at times it's useful to separate them, but most of the time there's no pure separation, there's no pure culture and no pure nature. Interaction as opposed to interaction is that the unit of analysis should be focused on what goes on between, for example, nature and humans, that actual process that happens, rather than those two separate entities. Stacey Alimo talks about transcorporeality, the substance of the human is ultimately inseparable from the environment. And Neymanis talks about the capacity or material agency or sociality, so the capacity for non-human matter to engage with other kinds of bodies. So these are different ways of thinking about sort of human and nature relationships. And what I found what's interesting is how sorry to go back to the previous one, of how both indigenous cultures and these sort of very modern feminist theoretical perspectives are coming back to the same ideas about this inseparability. And so what does that mean for how, when we think about the rights of nature and the usefulness of thinking about the concepts such as the rights of nature? So this Moth is a very interesting collective. One of the central people is Cesar Rodriguez Garabatido, who's written the book of the same name, the book called More Than Human Rights, An Ecology of Law, Thought and Narrative of Earthly Flourishing. Of earthly flourishing. And so he makes a case for more than human rights on the basis that and he's actually a lawyer, so the preamble to the book is all about why, from a legal perspective, we need to be critiquing the rights of nature and thinking about better ways to talk about it. So that the human world is not separate from, but completely nested within the more than human world. Hence, this is the sort of central argument for using this term. So that nature rights are not separate nor derivative from human rights. There's an innate reciprocity and interdependence. And you might ask, isn't this symbiosis, which interestingly, from a scientific perspective, has recently been sort of discovered, or is increasing work, scientific work, which is demonstrating something which, for example, indigenous communities have known for a very, 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 and lived alongside for a very, very, very long time. So in a sense, more human rights is alluding to this same sort of inseparability. Okay, these are just provocations, really. There isn't a conclusion here, except to say that perhaps we can think about multidisciplinary approaches and multiple ways of approaching the rights of nature and creating a climate dialogue. And I'm using here term of the pluriverse, which actually comes from the Zapatista movement, where I'm not sure if it was Subcomandante Marcos argued, we need un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos, a world where lots of worlds fit into it. So, as Joel Robbins has pointed out, anthropologists view the world through the great problems of the day. So anthropogenic climate change is this new enemy. It should bring together disciplines. And I think to understand this relationality between humans and nature, we need to bring together many disciplines. Understand relationality in sciences and the humanities, for example. So the nature of beings as interbeings, that's again an agreement, signifies the need for a different way of conceiving nature and recognizing and doing relationality. Different ways of conceiving things. Land as sensate, memorial as intentful, the need to establish reconceptualizations alongside rather than replacing the rights of nature. Doing the rights of nature, or more than human rights, through law, politics, the economics, decentering human privilege and challenging human desires, or the desires of the carbon economy. Language and literature, how we speak about people and how we speak about nature matters, because that goes on to express our relationality and goes on to influence how we relate. And the arts, imagining new ways of being and new ways of expressing these.
Thanks, Jenny. Well, I'd like to, we have run over, but we will continue if that's okay. I'd like to invite everybody up to sit behind the desk. Perhaps that's the desk. And we'll have some time for questions, I hope. You can on the desk somehow. So yeah, some fantastic presentations, I think, and the stakes are clearly high in many different senses of how we understand, make use of, and engage with planetary health from the perspective of health policy and practice, but also as researchers and educators, in considering what our conceptual tools are, what are the conceptual tools that are available to us, for example, understanding this kind of multiple environmental crisis unfolding, both how and where we do our research and with whom we collaborate. So, thank you all for contextualising, I think, those questions so well, and just giving us such rich and relevant sort of food to think with. I'd like to open the floor to questions and comments that people might have in general, or to specific speakers. It would be great to hear some of your reflections from some of these presentations.
Hi everyone. First, thank you so much for the fantastic presentations. Thank you for putting this point there, really good diversity of perspectives. I suppose I'll start with a comment and try to turn it into a question. But my observation is really that there seems to be at least two different ways in talking about planetary health, and I want to sort of go back to the notion of language and look at it from a linguistic perspective. So on the one hand, we can be using the notion of health as a metaphor, right? So for example, in Andrew's presentation, it's very clear that when we talk about planetary health, we're transferring the notion of health from one domain to the domain of the planet. This is why it only started being used in the 1980s or so. It's that notion of planetary health is health that pertains to the planet as such. On the other hand, in Marina's presentation, there was a very different notion of planetary health, which is a planet that produces healthy people, which is not so much a metaphorical notion of health as it is a metonymic notion. Right? It's cause and effect, and the health, people's health is the effect of a particular kind of environment. Now, with respect to a kind of policy agenda, the notion of planetary health is clearly one that we want to use to engage people with these ideas. And I just wanted to sort of ask for your reflections on how these two different ways of understanding planetary health relate to one another. Do we use one at some points and the other at other points to engage different kinds of stakeholders with different kinds of orientations? Do we mean something in between? How do we negotiate this kind of conflict when we communicate with the public? Apologies for a long question.
Whoever would like to pick that up.
I can start by saying that we don't use the word planetary health for that same reason, because we know that we don't talk about planetary health, and our presentation of global health within climate conversations is intentionally anthropocentric.
Right.
And that's because I generally, when I talk about this, I show kind of the latest Google search. If you Google climate change, and you see what imagery comes up from how online we're visually representing climate change, you don't see one person in any images. You see polar bears, you see scorched soil, you see grass, you see leaves, you see storms, but you don't see people. And we have good evidence to believe that there's a very intentional push to put people away from the climate conversation and make it sound like it's only affecting polar bears in the year 2100, and that has nothing to do with us. So our approach to this, and if you see kind of my presentation, I don't talk about mosquitoes, I don't talk about animals, I don't talk about the environment, I only talk about people and their health. And that is a dissociation that is very unconstructive in advancing a conversation about planetary health, but it's intentionally so to put people back where they have been removed from, because people are there and the climate and the environment is over here in the negotiation tables. So we're trying to say, no, this is about your health and your children. We don't care about the polar bears, of course not. And it might be quite cynical to be that way. And in the kind of changing of mentalities, it definitely does not help to kind of reinforce the anthropocentric drive to change our systems for people and from us and our health. But from the push that we see towards humans being detached from that conversation, we do see that that is kind of a strategy to make people care less, and people are very, very anthropocentric, generally, like the public, which is part of the problem, obviously. I think it was very interesting when you were talking about kind of indigenous peoples and how do we kind of reconciliate indigenous knowledges and cosmographies within what we do. And there's always that kind of push in what we do about, like, well, what about indigenous knowledge? And I think there is where indigenous people are, they are at the center of the intersection between planetary health, human health, environmental health. And they are driving, I think, a lot of that conversation in that kind of those negotiation tables, and they're being isolated because of that.
Anybody else like to pick up that question? No? Okay. Yes, please, yeah.
I'm not completely sure whether it is a metaphor, whether these are or if they are metaphors, they have material implications, real implications. So I understand your question, I understand what you mean, but especially when you read the histories of concepts of the environment or concepts of health and so on, they really do have very material, they often come out of material conditions and technologies and practices and so on, and they also feed back into them in a complex system, one might say. So I'm not sure about how big that distinction really would be if you kind of sat down and looked at it really closely, but I do understand the point of what you're saying, and I appreciate the point. I think it's a good point.
Good.
Any other comments and questions people wanted to pick up on? Yeah.
I was wondering about the deforestation in terms of water being a common denominator on the planet. What would the term be for the equivalent of deforestation in the damage or removal of water?
I don't have an answer to that question. I don't know why I'm being looked at, but
It's a good question.
yeah, it's a good question to pose.
Because everything's being destroyed
Yeah.
almost at the same time, but eventually we want.
Either deal with it.
Just a quick Actually, I wondered, when you used an example of planetary health when you were engaging with the practitioners and communities you were engaging with, and if so, did it mean anything to them? I mean, I'm just thinking about scale. There's a lot in this conversation about scale and the difficulty that most of us have working at scale. You know, always talk about doing something or, you know, how does scale come out in the conversations you're having?
Well, certainly on the first point, they refer, or some of them refer to themselves as planetary health practitioners.
Oh, really?
They did actually use that phrase. Others talked about being arts or creative or cultural practitioners, nature practitioners, and they usually, when you looked at other materials they supplied, like websites, leaflets, etc., talked about effects of the environment and climate change and offsetting that. When you're talking, did you say scale? When you
Yes, I mean, I just wondered how people engage with the problem of scale, which I think we all have as, you know, human actions, you know, when something is such a huge, massive issue, and that came out in your results around mental health, and people being anxious about the crisis. But whether you had any conversations about scale, but, you know, whether acting locally feels like it's meaningful in terms of the larger crisis that we face, or whether people feel that they can only really act locally and deal with their immediate environments.
Well, I mean, it did vary. I think it would, now you mention it, have actually helped the research. Given we were asking practitioners to comment on past sessions and activities and relationships with people. If we could have interviewed both the practitioners and the people taking part in their sessions, I think it might have given us another viewpoint, particularly if we could have involved people who were experiencing mental health issues taking part. As you say, it did come out as quite a large area, and people did, as I understand it, express a great deal of concern for the environment, which, as I mentioned, seemed to affect those who already were suffering from common mental health ailments such as anxiety and depression, but also people suffering from more severe symptoms such as schizophrenic symptoms and bipolar disorder. And I think in terms of the point about scale, that it does, when you're listening to the recordings or reading the transcripts, it does seem to come out across the board, but people express things rather differently. I've tried to obviously express the findings in my voice, in how we've interpreted the thematic analysis. I did the initial analysis, and a colleague then went through and checked that their understanding aligned with what they had taken in from the recordings and transcripts. And we did then run it past a third person for sense checking. And I mean, it's difficult when we've only in fact got less than just under 20 people to talk about, really to talk about terms of scale. But one of the practitioners, for example, was a part-time GP. So part of the time she worked in a primary care practice, and part of the time she was trying to do a form of, really, I suppose you'd call it social prescribing, and that she was checking out and recommending people take part in local provision of various social and nature, culture-oriented activities. And the advantage there was they were feeding back to the GP what the results were. So she was seeing how and expressing how beneficial it was for people to be involved in both social and natural activities in the natural world, or cultural activities. And I think that did show the effects that really people might have. I mean, starting from, you know, a very low number of people, there is potential there. But a very good question, thank you.
I'm conscious that there is another event starting at 5, and we actually have some drinks in the back of the room, which we may be able to take elsewhere, I'm not sure. But are there any quick final comments? I'm sorry we haven't had more time.
I'm just really going to quickly pick up on what Marina said earlier, right at the end, about Indigenous people being at the centre of this conversation, and like this connecting thing. And I think that they've been put on that pedestal, and I think they've been made this sort of emblematic, you know, sort of useful character in a sense, because I think there is a certain element of that, of this sort of this stereotypical idea of what an Indigenous person is and where they live and what they're representing. And I think, you know, and I think it's really, really, really important that their voices are heard. But I actually think what they're saying is being said in very many different spaces. You know, it's very clear that science knows about all that, about this interconnectedness. It's very clear, you know, and this is coming out of critical social sciences in what Marion was talking about. I just think there's a lot of interest, a lot of vested interest in not changing that current construction of being human and that separation with nature. There's a lot of, too many financial, political, global interests there so yeah, it was just to complicate a little bit more that last point.
Thank you, thanks Jenny. I think we do have to stop there, consciously in the back room, but I just want to thank all the speakers. I have a feeling this is possibly the start of this conversation rather than the end, but it's been super interesting to have such a diverse sort of set of perspectives on this question of planetary health, from practice to policy and different disciplinary approaches. So thank you so much. It's been really, really useful. Thank you all.